It had been months since Marissa first found the old store tucked between two dilapidated buildings in the forgotten corner of the city. The place had an unwelcoming air, with dust-coated windows and a sign that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, antiques and oddities. Something about it called to her, an invisible thread pulling her toward the door, as if it had been waiting for her all this time. She'd been looking for something to fill the silence of her life. Something old, something with history. What she didn't expect was that history would begin to haunt her. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The smell of aged wood and musty fabric filled her nostrils, and the air was thick with the weight of time. The shop was cluttered with all sorts of bizarre and forgotten relics, tarnished silverware, faded photographs, and strange statues that seemed to watch her with hollow eyes. But it was a vintage hearing aid that caught her attention. It was small, intricately designed, and unlike any she had ever seen. The brass was polished to a shine, and the small earbud seemed almost inviting. She picked it up, feeling the cold metal in her hands, and as she turned it over, a strange sensation prickled along her spine. There was something about it that felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be touched. But the old man behind the counter, his face hidden by thick glasses and a long, tangled beard, spoke up, his voice low and gravelly. "It's a special piece. Very old. Some say it lets you hear things you're not meant to." Marissa hesitated, the words sinking in like stones in her stomach. She glanced at the man, whose expression seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if there were something he wasn't telling her. But her curiosity won out. "How much?" she asked, unable to resist the pull of the object in her hands. "100, he replied, his voice trailing off as though he knew she wouldn't walk away without it. She handed over the money, and as the hearing aid passed into her possession, a strange feeling of dread settled over her. But the price was too tempting, and she could not leave without it. After all, she was alone in her apartment most nights, and the silence had become unbearable. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marissa sat in her dimly lit living room, her fingers running over the delicate curves of the hearing aid. The apartment was quiet, the usual hum of the city outside muted by the thick curtains she had drawn. She placed the earbud in her ear, her heart fluttering with anticipation. She turned the dial on the side, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no change. But then faintly, a low whisper began to seep into her mind. It was soft at first, like the wind through a crack in the door, but then the words became clearer, more distinct. "Help me. Help me." The voice was fragile, pleading, like a child lost in the woods, calling out for someone, anyone, to find them. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled the hearing aid from her ear, but the whispers lingered in her mind, haunting her thoughts. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer across the walls. No response came, but the air felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She set the hearing aid down on the coffee table, the whispers fading, but the unease remained. The next few days were a blur for Marissa. She went to work, ran errands, and tried to ignore the gnawing unease that had settled into her bones. But every time she looked at the hearing aid, or worse, when she thought about putting it back in her ear, her heart would race. The whispers hadn't returned, but the memory of them lingered like a dark cloud. She tried to convince herself that it had all been her imagination, nothing more than a trick of the mind, a momentary lapse in sanity. Yet, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the object was calling to her. The more she resisted, the more it seemed to pull at her thoughts, tugging her toward it like a weight around her neck. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself sitting at the edge of her bed, staring at the hearing aid on the nightstand. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The air was thick with stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was then that she heard it again, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the wind, curling into her ears. "Help me." It was softer now, as if it were coming from somewhere deep beneath the floor. Marissa shivered and stood, her legs unsteady as if they were no longer her own. The voice was different this time. It didn't sound like a child anymore. It was low and guttural, strained, as though it had been buried under years of dust and silence. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her feet carried her across the room. She reached for the hearing aid, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The room seemed to shrink around her as she slid the earbud back into her ear. The instant it clicked into place, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The voice was clearer now, almost demanding, "Help me, find me." Marissa's breath caught in her throat, and she turned toward the door. The hallway outside was dark, but she could feel something there, something watching her. The temperature had dropped, and she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, trying to calm herself. She had to know what was happening. She couldn't let this go, not now, not after everything she had felt. With a shaking hand, she reached for the doorknob. As the door creaked open, the sound of the whispers became a low hum in her ear. She stepped into the hallway, the silence of her apartment building stretching out in front of her. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and she felt as if she were being drawn somewhere, deeper into the heart of the building. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, but she couldn't stop herself. It was like an invisible force was guiding her, leading her down the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The building was old, but this part of it felt different, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves held something dark within them. The floorboards groaned underfoot as she walked, her footsteps echoing through the emptiness. She reached the end of the hall, where a door stood slightly ajar. Marissa froze. There had never been a door here before. She had lived in this building for years, and she was certain that she had never seen it, let alone noticed it. But now, as the whispers pulsed in her ear, she knew that it was the place she needed to go. Without thinking, she pushed the door open, the hinges screeching in protest. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, and the air was thick with dust and the scent of something long forgotten. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening now. She felt something move in the shadows, something just out of reach. A voice, deep, ragged, and full of pain, reached her ears. "Help me. It's not too late." The door slammed shut behind her, and Marissa jumped, her pulse quickening. She spun around, but there was no way out. The walls were closing in, the room constricting around her as the temperature plummeted. A single light bulb flickered above, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living things. She could feel the presence of something, someone in the room with her, though she could see nothing. The whispers were now a cacophony in her mind, screaming in terror and desperation. Marissa's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the door handle. But it wouldn't budge. She yanked it again, then pounded on the door, shouting for help. Her voice echoed back at her in the oppressive darkness, swallowed by the heavy silence that hung like a thick fog. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a dreadful stillness, as if the room itself were waiting for her to realize something she hadn't yet understood. A chill ran down her spine, and she glanced around in a blind panic. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, moving like living things, and from the darkest corner, a shape began to emerge. It was slow at first, a vague outline that seemed to form from the very darkness itself. Marissa's heart hammered in her chest as the shape became clearer. It was a figure, a person perhaps, but distorted, as if it had been twisted by time and decay. The figure moved toward her, the soft scrape of its feet on the floor sending a shiver through her bones. Marissa opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the approaching figure. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the very walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The shape grew clearer, revealing a woman, pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched into a twisted grin. The woman's voice came first, as a soft murmur, barely audible over the pounding of Marissa's heart. "You shouldn't have come here. You don't know what you've awakened." Her voice was strained, as if speaking caused her pain. Marissa's hands were clammy, her throat dry, and yet the need to understand, to know, compelled her to stay. "What is this place?" Marissa managed to whisper, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" The woman's grin widened, and for a moment, Marissa thought she saw something far darker lurking behind her eyes, something ancient and vengeful. "I was once like you," the woman rasped, "seeking, hearing things no one should hear. But now I'm trapped by what you've brought into this world." Marissa took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the hearing aid still clutched in her hand. "The hearing aid? It's the key, isn't it? It's the reason I'm here." The woman's laughter was a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated through the room, sending a cold chill through Marissa's chest. "Yes, that device. It's cursed, and it's tied to this place, to me." Her voice dropped to a whisper, almost conspiratorial. "You must leave before it's too late, before it pulls you in like it did me." Marissa's mind raced. Leave? But she couldn't, could she? The curiosity, the overwhelming pull to understand what had happened, to find out how deep the darkness ran, kept her rooted to the spot. But what was it the woman said? "It pulls you in?" A sense of dread swept over her as the woman's form seemed to flicker, like an image on a cracked mirror. For a brief moment, Marissa thought she saw a reflection of herself standing behind the woman, but it wasn't her. There was something different about it, something wrong. The reflection was smiling in a way she never had. A sudden sharp noise, like the screech of metal against metal, pierced the air, and Marissa snapped her head around, her heart racing. The walls of the room were shifting. The space around her seemed to bend, the lines between reality and something darker blurring before her eyes. The room was no longer still, but alive, breathing. The shadows twisted and coiled, and the whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding her, filling her mind. "Help me. Find me." The voice was no longer distant. It was all around her, inside her head, and she could feel it clawing at her thoughts, urging her towards something in the farthest corner of the room. But as she took a step forward, the woman's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with unnatural strength. Her grip was cold, like the touch of death itself. "No," the woman hissed. "Don't listen to it. Don't let it pull you under." But her voice faltered, her eyes wild with fear. "It's too late for me. You can't save me. You must leave now." Marissa's chest tightened, her heart struggling to keep up with the racing tempo of her thoughts. What had she done? What was the hearing aid? Was this woman a warning, or had she been another victim of the same curse? In her gut, Marissa knew she had no choice but to confront whatever this was, to face it head-on before it swallowed her whole. Marissa stood frozen, the woman's grip still cold around her wrist, pulling her back toward the center of the room. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that blended into a single, terrifying sound, like the rush of wind before a storm. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to get out of this place and never look back. But the pull of the hearing aid, the overwhelming need to understand what was happening, kept her rooted to the spot. The woman's eyes were wide with a mix of desperation and terror. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "It's not just a hearing aid, it's a gateway. A way for them to reach through, to speak to you, to claim you." Her words were wild now, frantic, as if the very act of speaking them was too much to bear. "I couldn't stop it. I listened for too long, and now I'm trapped." Marissa swallowed hard, her hand tightening around the hearing aid in her palm. It felt heavier now, like a weight she couldn't shake, a burden she had unknowingly accepted. She tried to pull away from the woman's grip, but the woman's fingers seemed to melt into her skin, like they were part of her, as though she herself was a part of the room, the darkness that surrounded them. What do you want from me?" Marissa asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why am I here?" The woman let out a soft, bitter laugh, her face twitching with a grimace. "You're here because you wanted to hear it. The truth, the whispers. But now they've found you, just like they found me. You're in their grip now, whether you know it or not." Her voice was hollow, devoid of any hope. "You have to destroy it. You have to destroy the hearing aid, or you'll never leave. If you don't end this, it will claim you, just like it did me." Marissa's heart raced as the shadows around her seemed to close in even tighter, the walls bending and pulsating as if they were alive. She looked down at the hearing aid in her hand, the brass gleaming in the dim light, and for a moment, it almost seemed to glow. The whispers surged inside her mind, growing louder and more insistent. Like an overwhelming tide she couldn't escape. Her fingers tightened around the device, and for a split second, she was flooded with an image, a vision of herself, lying in the center of the room, her body lifeless, her eyes empty. The woman's form flickered again, and Marissa realized with a sudden horror that she was staring at her future if she didn't act. She wasn't just seeing the woman's past, she was seeing what was about to become her own fate. With a scream, Marissa ripped the hearing aid from her ear and hurled it across the room. It landed with a sharp metallic clink against the wall, and for a moment, everything was still. The whispers ceased, the shadows paused in their writhing dance, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, the silence shattered. A deafening roar erupted from all around her. The walls cracked, the floor trembled beneath her feet, and the temperature plunged. The shadows that had once been only a part of the room now seemed to spill from the cracks in the walls, the ceiling, the very floor beneath her. They coalesced into a mass, a shape that towered over her, dark and formless, a presence that she could feel pressing down on her chest. The woman's voice was a whisper in her ear now, distant and broken. "You're too late. It's already begun. There's no escaping it now." Marissa stumbled back, her eyes wild, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows were closing in on her, thick and suffocating, and the whispers rose again, louder than before, each one more desperate and pleading. They were inside her head now, a constant barrage of voices, pulling at her mind, dragging her deeper into the abyss, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. With all her strength, Marissa charged forward, throwing herself at the door, pounding on it with her fists. But the door wouldn't open. It was as if the building itself was resisting her, as if it had become part of the darkness, part of the curse. The shadows surged around her, and just as she thought she would be consumed by them, she heard something. A voice, strong and clear, cutting through the chaos. "Leave." It wasn't the woman's voice. It wasn't any voice she had heard before, but it was real, and it was loud enough to shatter the hold the shadows had on her. With one final, desperate push, she flung the door open, and the room was flooded with light. The shadows recoiled, like creatures frightened by daylight, and the whispers faded into nothingness. Marissa stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. The darkness was still behind her, but she was free, at least, for now. As she made her way down the hallway, she could hear the distant sound of the door slamming shut behind her. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a warning. Marissa had escaped, but she knew deep down that the hearing aid, the darkness, the voices, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The past would always follow her, and so would the whispers. Mara never believed in the supernatural, not truly. But when she stumbled upon the old house at the end of Eldridge Lane, something about it stirred a deep, unexplainable feeling within her. The house had been on the market for months with no one else showing interest. Perhaps it was the price, affordable for someone trying to escape from the chaos of city life. Or maybe it was just the strange allure of the house that drew her in. She bought it on a whim, not knowing it would soon become the setting of her darkest fears. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian structure, with faded paint that seemed to peel back secrets from centuries past. It sat alone, surrounded by an overgrown garden, its windows like dark eyes staring into nothingness. As Mara unpacked her belongings, the house seemed to groan under the weight of its age, as though it were sighing from a long-forgotten memory. She found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, as if someone were watching her. The first night she spent there, alone in the echoing silence of the house, she heard it. A soft whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, she brushed it off as the wind, or perhaps the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was as though someone was moving around in the attic, pacing restlessly. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers growing into soft, unintelligible murmurs. Sleep didn't come that night. The next morning, she stood in front of the mirror, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her like a second skin. She told herself it was all in her head, that old houses made noises, and her mind had just started playing tricks on her. Still, She couldn't ignore the tightness in her chest, the sense that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The house was beautiful, no doubt, but it held a darkness that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. It wasn't long before Mara noticed more oddities. The floorboards in the hallway creaked underfoot, but they seemed to creak in a pattern, almost as if someone was walking just ahead of her. And in the evenings, after the sun dipped behind the horizon, she would hear footsteps from above, slow and deliberate, as though someone were pacing in the attic. When she'd climb the stairs to investigate, the sounds would stop, leaving only silence in their wake. It was as though the house was toying with her, challenging her to discover its secrets. By the end of the week, the house had become a constant source of anxiety. She began to question her decision, wondering if she had made a grave mistake. But every time she thought about leaving, a strange pull kept her in place. Something, maybe it was the house, or maybe it was the memories she was running from, held her there. And so, she endured the whispers, the footsteps, the constant, creeping dread. One night, as Mara sat alone in the parlor, the temperature suddenly dropped. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as her breath became visible in the cold air. The whispers returned, louder now, almost insistent. She turned towards the source of the sound, a door at the far end of the room, half open, beckoning her. It was the door to the basement, a place she hadn't dared explore yet. The feeling that something, someone, was waiting for her in the darkness gnawed at her. Mara froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The voice was clearer now, almost too calm, as if it were someone she knew. A quiet, distant whisper that had somehow made its way through the thick silence of the house. She blinked in disbelief, her breath caught in her throat. But when she glanced toward the basement door, there was no sign of anyone. The knocking had stopped, and the house seemed to settle into a deeper, more oppressive stillness. The weight of the silence was unbearable, and Mara could feel her mind unraveling with each passing second. What had happened in this house? She was certain now that it wasn't just her imagination. Something had been waiting for her here. Something old, something malevolent. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been alive in some way, that it was aware of her presence. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, clenching her fists as if to hold on to reality. "You're just tired, you're imagining things." But the unease wouldn't leave her. It gnawed at her, and she realized that she couldn't ignore it any longer. Mara had to know the truth. She needed to understand what had happened to this house, to its previous occupants, and why it was haunting her so relentlessly. She couldn't live in fear forever. Her determination was stronger now than the dread that had paralyzed her moments before. Determined, she forced herself to stand and walked slowly toward the hallway. The house seemed to exhale in relief as she took each step, the temperature around her dropping slightly. There was a small room off the parlor, one she had passed by many times without ever entering. It was locked, an old wooden door with a tarnished brass knob, but something told her that behind that door lay the key to everything, or answers. She took the old skeleton key she had found hidden beneath the floorboards the day she moved in and turned it in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, and the room smelled of age and neglect. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding faded, leather-bound books, yellowing photographs, and old trinkets that looked like they had been untouched for decades. At the far corner of the room was a large portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. A woman in a vintage wedding dress, her face pale and expressionless, staring straight at Mara as though she had been waiting for her all along. Mara's stomach turned. There was something about the woman's face, something so unsettling about her gaze that it made Mara feel as though she were being watched. She could almost hear the woman's voice whispering from the past, urging her forward, urging her to look deeper. She stepped closer to the portrait, her hands trembling as they hovered near the frame. The moment her fingers brushed against the glass, the room seemed to shift. A cold gust of wind swept through the space, blowing the pages of the books into the air like a flurry of snow. The lights flickered once again, casting shadows that danced across the walls. And in the distance, she could hear a faint melody playing. A song from another time, eerie and melancholic. The whispers started again, louder now, swirling around her in a disorienting frenzy. The woman in the portrait appeared to shift slightly, as though her lips moved, but Mara could not make out the words. She felt an icy chill crawl down her spine as her gaze locked with the woman's. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a voice, familiar yet distant, that echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come." Mara's pulse quickened, and for a moment she thought she might faint. The room spun around her, and she staggered backward, crashing into a table and knocking over a stack of books. One of the books fell open, its pages yellowed with age, and she caught a glimpse of something written in delicate cursive script. With shaking hands, she lifted the book and began to read. The Eldridge family, first inhabitants of the house, fell to ruin after the tragic disappearance of young Catherine Eldridge on her wedding day. It is said that the house... Her breath caught in her throat as she continued to read, the words revealing a dark history of the house, a history that had been buried beneath layers of dust and silence for over a century. Catherine Eldridge, the woman in the portrait, had vanished without a trace on her wedding night, never to be seen again. Some said she had been murdered. Others whispered that she had simply disappeared into thin air, a victim of the house itself. Mara slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. The whispers had returned, louder now, almost frantic, and the temperature in the room had dropped so suddenly that she could see her breath clouding in the air. The portrait of Catherine seemed to leer at her now, as though mocking her attempts to understand the tragedy that had unfolded in this very house. Mara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, urgent, pulling her toward the basement door as if it were calling her name. She didn't know what to expect. She had only seen the basement once, during her initial walkthrough of the house, but it had been a place she deliberately avoided. The door, barely ajar, beckoned her with an unsettling invitation that filled the room with a chill that was more than just physical. It was as if the house itself was waiting, watching. Taking a deep breath, Mara steeled herself. She couldn't keep running from whatever this was. She had to face it, whatever it might be. Stepping forward, she hesitated just for a moment before pushing the door open with a soft creak. The basement stairs stretched downward into an impenetrable darkness. She reached for the light switch, but the power seemed to flicker and die before she could reach it. A wave of panic rose in her chest as she was plunged into complete blackness, the silence of the house pressing in around her. "Just a basement," she whispered to herself, but her voice sounded foreign in the stillness. Just an old, unused basement. She descended cautiously, each step creaking beneath her weight, the sound echoing eerily in the cold air. Her hand brushed the wooden railing, and she felt a strange shiver run up her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air was thick, heavy with the mustiness of age, and as she reached the bottom, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. A scraping noise, like something, or someone, dragging across the floor. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, scanning the room with straining eyes, but the darkness was impenetrable. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound calm. Her words seemed to vanish into the thick blackness, absorbed by the old, damp stone walls. There was no response, just the slow, rhythmic sound of something shifting. Then, a low growl echoed from the far corner of the basement, followed by the distinct sound of nails scraping against the floor. Mara's heart raced, and she backed up instinctively, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. The faint glow from the screen barely illuminated her surroundings, revealing only a few old boxes and rusted tools. But the growling didn't stop. It was closer now, the sound vibrating through her bones. Something in the dark was moving toward her. Her breath hitched as a low, guttural voice whispered from the shadows, "Leave." Mara didn't have to be told twice. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her feet pounding against the wooden steps as she raced toward the door. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and her thoughts became a blur of fear. She reached the top of the stairs and threw herself into the hallway, slamming the basement door behind her with a force that shook the walls. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed her up, swirling around her like a storm. She could feel them, like fingers brushing against her skin, their icy touch lingering long after they were gone. She sank to the floor, her back pressed against the door, trying to catch her breath. Her mind raced with questions. What was that growling? And the voice? What did it mean? The house had always felt strange, but now it felt suffocating, oppressive, like something was pressing in from all sides. She looked up, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the hallway, just at the edge of the shadows. But when she blinked, it was gone. A soft knock echoed from the basement door, followed by a voice, calm and insistent. "You can't leave." Mara stumbled back, her mind reeling. The book's revelations had sent her spiraling. Catherine Eldridge, the woman in the portrait, had been tied to the house by more than just her appearance in the dusty photograph. She was a part of its story, its curse, and whatever had happened to her on that fateful night had lingered, seeping into the walls and floors, haunting everything in the house. Mara wasn't just a bystander in this tale. She was an unwitting participant. The whispers returned, rising and falling like a tide. It was no longer just a faint murmur in the background. It was clear now, the voices begging her to listen, pleading with her to understand. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the room pulsed with an eerie energy, as if the house itself were alive and aware of her presence. Mara felt something in the air shift, the oppressive atmosphere thickening until it felt like it was suffocating her. Mara had to know more. She couldn't let the house swallow her like it had swallowed Catherine. She couldn't let it claim her as it had countless others, feeding on their fear and curiosity. The pull to investigate deeper was irresistible, and as much as her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run as far as she could, something anchored her in place. The truth was here, somewhere in the house, and Mara had already come too far to turn back. The basement door creaked open again, this time with a force that sent a shiver down her spine. It was as though it were waiting for her to return. She didn't need to think twice. The house had already taken too much from her, her peace, her sense of safety, and now it wanted more. She would not let it consume her like it had consumed the others. She had to confront it head-on. The cold air greeted her as she descended into the basement once again, this time with a determination she hadn't known she was capable of. The growls were louder now, more menacing. But Mara did not falter. She moved deeper into the room, guided only by the weak light of her phone and her resolve. As she reached the center of the basement, something caught her eye, a shadow moving in the corner, a shape that shouldn't have been there. She turned toward it, her breath catching in her throat. It was Catherine. The figure of a woman stood just beyond the edge of the light, her wedding dress tattered and stained, her eyes hollow and dark. The figure didn't move, but it radiated a terrible, magnetic presence. Mara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she stepped closer, her pulse quickening. "Catherine?" she whispered, the name barely escaping her lips. The figure's lips parted, and a low, guttural voice emerged from her trembling form. "You shouldn't have come back," it rasped. "This place never lets go." Mara's breath hitched. "What happened to you?" she managed to say, the words barely audible as the room around her seemed to distort. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward her like dark tendrils. Catherine's figure flickered, as though made of smoke, her face contorting in agony. "I was married," she whispered, "but he wasn't the man I thought he was. The house changed him. It changed me too." Mara took a step forward, reaching out as if to help her, but Catherine's form began to dissolve, her image flickering like a dying flame. "The house feeds on what you love," Catherine's voice echoed, now distorted, her form nothing but a faint outline of light. "It makes you a part of it, and in the end, you can never leave. We are all part of the house now." The temperature dropped sharply, and Mara gasped as a powerful gust of wind slammed into her, forcing her to her knees. The whispers, the growls, the distorted images, they all merged into a cacophony of sound, a chaotic maelstrom of voices crying out in agony, begging for release. The walls seemed to press in on her, and she felt the weight of the house's dark history crushing down on her. It was all too much. The fear, the despair, the relentless pressure to uncover the truth. It had all come to this. Suddenly, everything stopped. The house was silent again, eerily still. Mara remained on the floor, gasping for air, her heart racing in her chest. Her mind struggled to process what she had just witnessed. Had it been real? Or had the house merely driven her to the brink of madness? In the silence, she heard a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a clear, calm voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "It's over," it said. "You have found the truth. Now you are part of it." Mara's head shot up, her eyes wild with terror. The house wasn't done with her. It wasn't done feeding on her fear, and now it would never let her go. The light flickered one last time, and in the darkness, Mara felt something cold wrap around her, pulling her into the depths of the house. And the whispers never stopped. It was the kind of house no one ever spoke about. Yet everyone in the small town of Greystone knew exactly where it stood. Tucked away on Hollow Hill, its once grand facade had been overtaken by creeping ivy, the windows boarded up as if to shut out the memories of a long-forgotten past. A place everyone avoided, as if the very air surrounding it had become poisoned. Yet for Emily Cartwright, a young woman eager to escape the noise of city life, it seemed the perfect opportunity. The price was too good to pass up. Emily had stumbled across the listing in a forgotten corner of the real estate website, buried beneath newer, more attractive homes. There it was, vintage house for sale, inquire within, with a price that seemed too low for the size and location. The photo attached to the listing showed a majestic mansion, albeit with darkened windows and the unmistakable air of abandonment. It spoke to something inside Emily, a desire to begin fresh, to embrace the challenge of restoring something old and forgotten, and perhaps to make a name for herself in a town that had long passed her by. When Emily first arrived, the house seemed quieter than she expected. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and old memories. Inside, dust covered the floors, and the silence was thick, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for years. The creaking floors and the distant echoes of her footsteps as she wandered through the empty rooms only served to heighten the sense of isolation. Yet there was a strange comfort in it, too, a feeling of peace that she hadn't known in years. As Emily explored the house, she began to realize the scale of the task ahead of her. The wooden panels were worn, the wallpaper peeling in places where the humidity had worn it down over time. But there was beauty in the details. The intricate carvings on the banister, the delicate stained glass windows that still glimmered faintly in the dim light. It was clear that this house had once been loved, perhaps even revered, by someone long ago. But it didn't take long for Emily to notice the strange occurrences. The first time it happened, she chalked it up to nerves, an unfamiliar house, a new life, and the weight of so many decisions pressing down on her. She had been in the kitchen, unpacking her things, when she heard it. A soft tapping from above, as though something or someone was knocking on the ceiling. Startled, she stood still, listening. The noise stopped as soon as it had begun. She forced herself to shrug it off. Perhaps it was just the house settling, she thought. However, the noises didn't stop. Over the next few days, as Emily worked to clean and organize, the sounds grew more frequent. A door would creak open by itself. The faintest whisper would drift through the empty halls, like a sigh caught on the wind. She began to wonder if the house was truly as empty as it seemed. Each time she went to investigate, there was nothing, just silence, waiting for her to leave. On the fourth night, the noises grew louder. It was a thud, followed by dragging sounds. Emily froze, standing in the middle of the hallway with her breath caught in her chest. It was coming from the attic. She had heard the stories, the town's hushed warnings of things left behind by previous owners, the strange tales of those who had come before her. She had dismissed them as superstition, the harmless gossip of a small town. But now, the air felt thick with something else, something darker. With a racing heart, Emily grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the creaking stairs to the attic. The door stood ajar, just wide enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. She hesitated, her hand trembling on the handle. The sounds from within seemed to beckon her forward, as though the house was calling her, daring her to uncover its secrets. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open, stepping into the unknown. The attic was a place of forgotten things. Old trunks, dusty furniture covered with sheets, and yellowed photographs that seemed to stare back at her from across the room. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and mildew, and the dim beam of Emily's flashlight barely cut through the darkness. But it wasn't the clutter or the darkness that caught her attention. It was the strange, cold draft that swept across her face as soon as she stepped inside. The noise was louder now, unmistakable, a soft, dragging sound like the scraping of something heavy against the wooden floorboards. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she cautiously made her way toward the source of the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She scanned the room, eyes darting from one shadowy corner to the next. The attic, though full of forgotten belongings, seemed empty of life. Yet the sound persisted. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no reply, only the continued dragging sound that seemed to circle the room, as if taunting her. She could feel her pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The house had been silent for so long. Why was it suddenly so alive? A small creak to her left made her whip around, the beam of her flashlight landing on an old rocking chair. It was moving ever so slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. The chair's wooden arms groaned in protest, the motion slow and deliberate. The dragging sound was louder now, and Emily felt the temperature drop even further. She was no longer alone in the attic. She stepped forward, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The light caught on something, an old faded portrait leaning against the wall. Emily's hand instinctively reached out for it, though she wasn't sure why. The painting depicted a woman in a wedding gown, her expression serene but haunting. The dress was unlike any Emily had ever seen, vintage from a bygone era, its lace and silk intricate and delicate. The woman's eyes, though painted with care, seemed to follow Emily as she moved closer. The feeling of being watched intensified. Emily placed the portrait down gently, a sense of unease settling over her. She turned back toward the rocking chair, and that was when she saw it. On the far side of the room, a figure. It was a blur, indistinct and flickering like a candle's flame caught in the wind. For a brief moment, it stood perfectly still, before it moved, gliding across the room with unnerving smoothness. Emily gasped, taking a step back. She stumbled, her foot catching on an old trunk, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound echoed throughout the attic, louder than any of the strange noises before. The figure vanished in an instant, leaving only the emptiness behind. Her heart raced as she stood frozen, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The dragging sound had stopped. The house, for a brief moment, was still, but Emily knew that something had shifted, something had been awakened. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Her mind raced as she wondered whether it was her imagination or if the house was truly haunted. She had heard the whispers from the locals, the rumors of a wedding that never happened, of a bride who disappeared into the house's dark history. It was said that the woman in the portrait was not just a memory, she was part of something far darker. As she turned to leave the attic, Emily's flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed her whole, and she felt the oppressive weight of the house pressing in on her. It was then that she heard it, soft at first but unmistakable, the sound of someone breathing. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the sound of the breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't her own. This breath was heavier, labored, as though someone, or something, was standing just behind her. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but the attic remained as still as it had been before. The air was thick and suffocating, the silence unnerving. The only light now was the faint glow from the moon, barely visible through the small attic window, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. She stepped backward, her eyes scanning every inch of the attic, her pulse rising. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. The flashlight had gone out, and her phone was downstairs, charging in the kitchen. She cursed her own fear as she groped in the dark, trying to make sense of the sounds and the strange sensations that gripped her. Suddenly, a cold hand, icy and firm, pressed against her shoulder. Emily screamed, whirling around to face whatever was behind her. But once again, there was nothing. The attic was empty, silent except for her own panicked breathing. With shaking hands, Emily grabbed the edge of a trunk for support, trying to steady herself. She had to get out. She had to leave the house, leave the past behind. But something held her in place, a force beyond her comprehension. The darkness, the eerie quiet of the house, it felt alive. As if it was waiting for her to make the next move, to unravel the truth of what had been buried here for so long. It was then that her eyes fell on the old wedding dress. It had been pushed aside earlier, tucked into an old wardrobe in the corner of the room, its delicate lace catching the weak light. Emily hesitated, a strange pull in her chest urging her closer. The dress was beautiful, almost haunting in its elegance, but something about it seemed wrong, unnatural, as though it didn't belong. Compelled by a force she didn't understand, Emily reached for the dress. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath formed visible clouds in the air as a chill gripped her to the bone. The house seemed to groan under some invisible pressure, and a soft whisper filled her ears, like voices muttering just beneath her awareness. Don't wear it." The voice was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it was unmistakable. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. She looked around frantically, but there was no one else in the attic. She had heard it, though, clear as day. The voice of a woman, one who had been lost to time, trapped in the house's dark history. Her eyes darted to the wedding portrait again. The woman's expression had changed. What was once a serene, peaceful smile was now a twisted grimace, as if she was silently screaming for help. Emily's blood ran cold as the air thickened around her. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. With trembling hands, Emily grabbed the edge of the dress again. This time, it was different. The fabric seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, and as she pulled it out of the wardrobe, the room seemed to warp around her. The walls creaked, and the floorboards groaned as though they were shifting beneath her feet. A sudden gust of wind slammed the attic window open, causing dust to swirl in the air. The voices grew louder, clearer. Now it wasn't just one voice, but many, overlapping, chanting something she couldn't quite make out. It was a song, a lullaby that felt as old as the house itself. Her body froze, caught in a trance, the dress now glowing eerily in her hands. The attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. Emily spun around, her heart pounding in her chest as the light from the moon flickered, casting dark shadows across the walls. And then she saw it, the woman from the portrait, standing in the far corner of the room, her face contorted in anguish, her hands reaching out as if begging for release. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice chilling and hollow. "Help me finish it." Emily staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The woman's presence was suffocating, filling the room with an intense, crushing weight. She tried to move, tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The dress pulsed in her hands, and the air around her seemed to warp and distort. "Help me," the voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. Emily's vision blurred as the room spun around her, her body consumed by a sudden wave of dizziness. She dropped the dress, unable to hold it any longer, and fell to her knees, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The walls closed in on her, and the whispers became a roar, a cacophony of voices from the past, demanding something, demanding that she finish what had been started. Emily's vision began to blur, the edges of the room distorting, and the whispers surrounding her became deafening. She could barely hear herself think as the oppressive weight of the house pushed down on her chest, its secrets closing in from every corner. The woman in the portrait was no longer in the corner of the room. Now, she stood directly in front of Emily, her ghostly figure towering over her, her eyes hollow and pleading. The wedding dress hung in the air, almost floating, just inches from Emily's face. The voices swirled around Emily like a storm. "Help me. Finish it. She never did. You must." Each word felt like a strike against her consciousness, pulling her deeper into the madness of the house. The woman's fingers twitched, reaching toward the dress in Emily's trembling hands. She could feel the coldness of her touch, the icy grasp of the past trying to pull her into it. Emily couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The air around her thickened, suffocating her with the weight of the house's history. Images of a woman in the dress, standing at the altar, then the image warped, her face now twisted in terror as she screamed, her body falling to the ground as blood pooled at her feet. No, this is not real," Emily thought desperately, her mind fighting against the overwhelming presence in the room. But the image in her mind was too strong. The house had trapped her, and she was losing herself to the haunting memory of what had happened here so long ago. The door to the attic creaked open behind her, and Emily's body jerked toward it. The room was no longer confined to just the attic. The walls were now fluid, rippling like water, and the images from the past flooded into the present. She saw a man, his face distorted with grief and rage, standing over the woman in the wedding dress. He was yelling, his words lost in the whirlwind of whispers. Then the woman's figure, a blur of white lace and blood, vanished into the shadows of the house. The house had consumed her. The woman in the portrait, she had been a bride, torn away from the world by forces she could not understand. It was her story, her suffering, that had given the house its dark power, its ability to reach across time and claim the souls of those who dared to step inside. And now, Emily was part of that legacy. Tears stung Emily's eyes as she tried to stand. The house was holding her down, its grip growing tighter with each passing second. She could feel the floor beneath her, now slick with something cold and wet. The whispers became louder, more frantic, as if they had all come from the woman in the dress. "Finish it." The dress was in her hands, its lace now coiling like tendrils, wrapping around her wrists. It wanted to be worn. With a sudden burst of strength, Emily pulled herself to her feet. Her body ached, her chest heaving for air, but she couldn't stop now. The whispers, finish it," rang in her ears, drowning out everything else. She knew what she had to do. The wedding dress, her only link to the tragedy, to the woman who had been lost, was the key. Emily's hand shook violently as she held the dress, her fingers brushing against its delicate fabric. The air around her crackled with energy. It was too much to bear. The house, the curse, the woman's spirit, it all boiled down to this one final act. She stood there, frozen for a moment longer. And then, with no more hesitation, Emily stepped into the wedding dress. As soon as she did, the house shook violently, its walls groaning as though the entire structure was about to collapse. A cold wind tore through the attic, and the whispers became deafening, a storm of voices, pleading and angry. The woman in the portrait, no longer just a painting, but a presence, stood behind Emily, her skeletal hands resting on Emily's shoulders, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "You are the last to wear it," the voice said, trembling with despair. "Now you are bound to the house, to the curse, to me." Emily gasped, feeling her soul being pulled into the darkness. The woman's cold fingers tightened around her, and she could feel the icy presence of the past consuming her, dragging her into the same fate as the bride who had been lost so long ago. The dress, once a symbol of innocence and joy, had become a shroud of death, and Emily was now a part of its legacy. The house seemed to sigh, a final breath, as the last whispers faded into silence. Emily stood there, her eyes wide, her body trembling as the walls of the house seemed to collapse in on themselves. The attic door slammed shut behind her, locking her in. In the end, the house had won.